You're listening to the Authorpreneur podcast, episode number 28. Welcome to the Authorpreneur podcast. I'm your host, thriller writer Amelia Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at ameliahay.com/podcast. Welcome to the final installment of this mini-series on how to structure a story using the hero's journey. In this show, I will share 5 tips on how to structure a story using the hero's journey. And at the end of this episode, I'll also share examples of this story structure in film and literature and provide you with a list of recommended reading so you can do further research. So let's get started. Tip number 1, create the hero and the villain. When you decide to write a novel, usually you have a vague story idea. Before I started writing Missing, the story idea started off with a simple one-line story idea. And that idea was a museum curator returns home from a successful dig to find an artifact stolen and her assistant lying face down in a pool of blood in her living room. This idea is the opening scene or the crime that the story is centered around. And it's evolved a lot since its origins. Because this particular story is a part of a crime thriller series, I already have a hero and it's not the museum curator, but you probably don't have a hero, and I recommend you don't start with the hero. I know what you're thinking, it's the hero's journey, but bear with me for a second. Start with the villain first. If you want to create a complex 3-dimensional adversary for your protagonist, you need to start here. What usually happens when you start with the hero is the villain often comes off as 2-dimensional. How do I know this? I had this issue with Missing. My villain and his team lacked realistic motivations and depth. Once I started fleshing out these people, they are now my favorite characters. There's a large part of me that loves writing James Lalonde, but these other characters are just important. In terms of fleshing out your villain, explore their back history. None of this will make it into the story, but the reader can tell that you know your characters through the way you portray them on the page. Consider who your villain is behind closed doors, and not just the side of their character they reveal to the world. How do they understand and view the world around them? You will find that when you create these 2 main characters, you'll be fleshing out the conflict and the world building simultaneously. It's just easier for me to share these tips as separate tips. Just like you and I, your villain should have a personal evolution. No one wakes up one morning and decides to be pure evil. It's a journey, not a sudden transformation. So how did they get to where they are at the start of your story? What crucial moments shaped your villain? Now it's time to consider your bad guy's motivations. What do they want and why do they want this? Make this reason compelling and emotional because it's the driving force behind every action they take. What's at stake for your villain? In essence, what are the consequences of their failure? Now go back and do the same with your hero. Your hero and villain are both sides of the same coin. They are almost mirror images of each other. You might also want to consider hobbies, quirks, bad habits to make them as relatable as possible. Out of these characters will naturally come conflict and a journey to resolve this conflict. That's why you start with the characters and not the plot. Realistically, characters and plot go hand in hand. It is hard to separate these steps, but for the sake of this podcast episode, I want to create steps that you can actually follow. Tip number 2, flesh out the core conflict of your story and the cast of characters. Story is conflict, and people have a natural way of creating conflict. But first, you need to create a 1-page synopsis or even a few short paragraphs summarizing the basic plot of your story. This stuff doesn't have to be a huge thing, just write out what you already know. The next step is to figure out your story's main problem. What pushes your main character out of their comfort zone? It doesn't have to be a huge event, but needs to be a big deal for your hero. Whatever it is that encourages your hero to leave his everyday world, it must be orchestrated by the villain. Both of their worlds need to collide in some way, even if it's by accident. It usually is because the villain doesn't know the protagonist exists at this point. Unfortunately, life isn't going to be smooth sailing for your hero. It's time to figure out what gets in his way. To help you discover the stakes and obstacles along your hero's path, ask yourself the following questions. What obstacles get in the way of your protagonist? What mini successes does the villain achieve along the way? Who is your hero's mentor? Who are your hero's allies? Which one of these allies changes sides? What leads to the villain's eventual demise? At some point, your villain will get overconfident, usually for a valid reason, and count their chickens before they hatch. I'm going to leave this tip here because fleshing out a story idea into a synopsis is a huge topic in and of itself. And it's a topic that I've covered in this podcast and on my YouTube channel. Check out episodes 7 and 8 for more tips on how to flesh out your story idea into a synopsis. And if you want quick links for these episodes, I will include them in your podcast show notes. Tip number 3. Build your story's world. I'm by no means a world building expert, but here are a few of my thoughts when it comes to world building. The world needs to be immersive. That's the reason why readers turn to the fantasy genre. If you're writing a story that follows the hero's journey, I guess this is the assumption that I'm making, that you're writing within the sci-fi and fantasy genre. But there are no rules when it comes to using this story structure. You can use it in anything, but the majority of books that I've seen this in, this is where they sort of sit in the Amazon bookstore. In order to create an immersive world, here are a list of things to consider. Number 1, does your world obey the natural laws of science? Number 2, in terms of technology, what exists and what does not? Number 3, does magic exist and what are its limitations? Number 4, is there a higher power? If so, who are the god or gods? Also, consider the role religion plays in everyday life and the annual festivals that people in your world observe. Number 5, is your government a republic, feudal society, a democracy, a place where an absolute monarch rules? And how do people rise to power within your world? And lastly, number 6, what are the core beliefs of the society? And I'm not necessarily referring to religion, but consider health, superstition, and the things of this nature, because people have beliefs around these particular things. Even if they're true or not, there is things people believe today, especially when in terms of reproduction. Like I listen to a lot of mummy vloggers and some of them talk about, how to conceive a child. And I know this is way off topic, but I found this hilarious because a lot of them talk about, laying flat and keeping your legs elevated to make sure sperm find their way to where they need to. And if you talk to, not that I'm an obstetrician, but if you talk to obstetricians and fertility specialists, they actually tell you this is a waste of time and quite often it's a great way to get a urinary tract infection. However, people believe these things, and the same should be true of your world. Whether they're sort of fact or fiction, people believe certain things. I think it's based on their experience. Something happens to them and they sort of conclude this happened because of X, Y, Z, and suddenly this becomes a core belief for them. Along with that list, you might want to create a brief world history where you would include significant battles and other moments that shaped your world. Because I'm no expert, over in the show notes at ameliahay.com/episode-028, I'll share links to other great articles on world building that I've used during my own research for an ongoing fantasy series that I'm writing. And what I mean by writing is this particular series is just in its infancy, like it's just a string of ideas. I haven't even strung together an outline. It's just a super long synopsis or treatment. Tip number 4, plot out the key scenes. This step is going to be very short because you've already done a lot of work up to this point. Go back over the 12 stages of the hero's journey and create a short description of what happens in your story for each of these stages. Again, draw from the ideas that you came up with in the previous steps. This exercise doesn't have to be full of detail if that's not your thing. Add as much or as little detail as you like. If you're a discovery writer and feel suffocated by this much detail, that's okay. You don't have to plan and write as I do. I realize that's not for everyone. Part of the reason why I do this is I'm a control freak. Knowing the details is a comfort to me, except if I'm at the top of St. Peter's Basilica and I know that I have to travel 300 steps down because I'm absolutely terrified of heights. And just saying that really stresses me out. Like, I'm trying really hard to be calm right now. Just the thought of that, it's a nightmare that I've endured. What is it like? Roland's probably listening to this going, oh my God, Amelia, that was 2 years ago. No, 3 years ago now. Build a bridge. Actually, he would never say that because he's super sweet. Tip number 5, flesh out the scenes between the key moments. If you're more of a discovery writer, then you don't have to follow this step and the last step. The reason steps 4 and 5 exist is because I'm an extensive outliner and I don't know how to teach any other way. It's just, all I know is my way. Like, I don't even understand how a discovery writer would write a novel because that's just how I think and it's how my brain's wired. So do what works for you and only take on board the tips that suit your style of writing. Don't try and bend yourself to someone else's style if the thought of writing like me scares you, you don't have to do that. And I tell my writing coach and clients like this, you need to write in a way that works for you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to try and bend to be like someone else. If it works for you, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Back to fleshing out your story moments. What needs to happen between the moments you fleshed out in step 4 for the story to make sense? At this stage, you might want to do a bit of research. If you're writing science fiction, then watch a few of your favorite movies or read a few books. For those of you who are writing fantasy, check out exhibits at museums, watch documentaries, read books, and watch films. Don't write a film. They'll take forever. Research isn't just about ripping off ideas, but getting a glimpse of what readers expect and filling your creative vault so that when you draw from it, it's not empty. After the research phase, go back and write down the ideas you have for scenes. The end product should be a synopsis or a scene-by-scene outline spanning a few pages. Take a break, then read your scene outline or synopsis and ask yourself the following questions. Does the story make sense? Is your story dragging in places? How can you make the story more exciting? Are there too many moments where everything seems to be all smooth sailing for your hero? Can you raise the stakes by adding more conflict to the story? The next step is to go back over your list of scenes and make revisions to the story moments that need to change. One of the best ways to learn story structure is through reading. Blog posts, books, and podcasts are great. However, seeing something in action is a far better way to learn. Because I just spent the last 3 episodes of this podcast talking about the 12 stages of the hero's journey, here are examples of fiction novels that follow this story structure. You'll notice that the following examples are all from the science fiction and fantasy genres. The reason is I couldn't confidently recommend books outside of these genres that use the hero's journey. The Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling, the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, the Hunger Games trilogy, Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, Stardust by Neil Gaiman, actually I really love that, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. A lot of these are some of these are obviously classics. And when you do read classics, just keep in mind that literature has changed over time. And so just read a mixture of both the classics and modern literature, just to give yourself an idea of how this story structure is used. Here are a few examples of the hero's journey used as story structure in films. I know that film is generally written in a slightly different way to novels, and you can do things in a movie that you can't quite do in a book. The same is also true the other way around. I wanted to share this list because it includes a few classics that hopefully everyone has seen. And if you haven't, you know what your homework is. The Empire Strikes Back, Groundhog Day, The Matrix, The Wizard of Oz, and The Princess Bride. I wanted to keep this short because I could have gone on forever, but just for the sake of time, that's the list. Much of the material in this mini-series on the hero's journey is taken from the book The Writer's Journey by Christopher Voigtler, and I have a funny feeling I've butchered his name in absolutely every episode of this podcast, so yeah, sorry. It's a huge book and it serves as an excellent reference guide, and clearly it's a book that I believe every writer should have on their shelf. Chapters 11, 12 and 13 of Chris Fox's book Plot Gardening contain a story structure adapted from the Hero's Journey by Dan Harmon, most famously known as the creator of the TV show Community. His story Circle is a simplified but nonetheless great adaptation of this story structure. If you're a beginner and these last 3 episodes of the show have overwhelmed you, then this is a great alternative. To structure a story using the hero's journey, I recommend you follow the following 5 tips. Start with the hero and the villain. Flesh out the core conflict of your story and the cast of characters. Build your story's world, plot out the key scenes, and flesh out the scenes between the key moments. Now I have 2 important questions to ask you. Are you structuring your story using the hero's journey? Which one of these tips did you find most helpful? I want to hear from you. Come over to the blog post at ameliahay.com/028 and share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for listening and happy reading and writing, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur podcast. If you love this episode, then hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favourite podcasting app. I'm your host, Amelia Hay, and I'll see you next week for another episode.